Growing up, I lived in a house right smack in the middle of my local cemetery. I didn't like it much when I was a kid, being easily spooked by it and all that. But I grew to appreciate it a lot more as I got older, as I always had a place to go running without a lot of other people around, and it was a nice quiet place. Keep in mind, this cemetery is huge, like at the very least 2,000 graves. When I was growing up, around age 13 or so, I would venture out late with the neighbor kids who lived around me, so the cemetery never really scared me much when I was older, despite the fact that there are absolutely no lights, not even something reminiscent of a streetlight, to be found in the cemetery. I was about 16 years old when one of my friends from school was staying the night at my house over the summer, and it was shortly after midnight. We had been at a loss as to what to do all night, and us being two bored teenage girls, I brought up a mildly unsafe idea. Want to go for a walk in the cemetery? At first, my friend was pretty reluctant, but with a couple of minutes of persuasion, she eventually warmed up to it. I told her, "I've lived here my whole life and done this dozens of times, and I've yet to encounter anything or anyone creepy, I promise." Which was, for the most part, true. So we snuck out my side door, being careful not to wake my parents, and we trekked up the steep path that leads from the street in front of my house to the cemetery. The cemetery is the basic shape of a circle, with another path connecting through it long ways, and another path that cuts halfway through perpendicular to the other path. And it eventually has an exit that leads out to a main road. My friend and I walked for about a couple of minutes until we made it down the path that cuts directly through the cemetery, which gives you a view of the main road on which you can enter the cemetery, and the entrance was about 7 yards away. Our conversation was cut short by a suspicious car that slowed around the cemetery entrance, eventually coming to a stop in the direct middle of the main road. We didn't even need to communicate to each other just how strange this was. People tend to fly down this road, and if you stop dead in the middle, you're bound to get hit, jam up traffic, or at least raise a couple eyebrows. Eventually, we saw the dark window of the passenger side roll down slightly, and out of all things that could have happened, what we heard was probably not the worst, but to this day, it still remains one of the most haunting, bone-chilling sounds I've ever heard. Instead of catcalling or even trying to get our attention, whoever was in the car just whistled. But not a wolf whistle or anything, just a strange, drawn-out tone that cut sharply upward at the end that seemed to echo off every stone and grass-covered hill around us. Think kind of like the whistle at the beginning of West Side Story. This sound occurred about 3 times before I finally let out, "What the heck?" Suddenly, the car reversed, and I realized with horror what it was doing. It was trying to back up towards the cemetery entrance, right where we were. The minute we saw it move, I started noping backward up the path until I just shouted, "Run!" We broke into a sprint the entire way back to my house, all the while that whistle echoed, even when the car was pretty much out of sight. I didn't have my glasses on, and the cemetery was lit by nothing but the moon, so I had a difficult time locating the path back to my house, stumbling past gravestones and through the grass. We made it onto my street, and we bolted towards my house when we heard the whistle one last time. I locked the doors, and we sat catching our breath for a good 5 minutes before we even talked about what had just happened. To this day, my parents still don't know that we snuck out, or that any of this happened. In retrospect, it was probably just someone calling out for a lost pet, but the circumstances and my friend's initial reluctance probably blew it out of proportion. But then again, who goes looking for a lost pet at 12:30 at night? I'm a female, and when I was 16, I hung out mostly with a small group of friends. Toby was gay, John was a small guy who posed at being macho, and a foreign exchange student from Spain named Maria. At the time, Both I and John had a bit of a crush on Maria since she was bisexual. So we both attempted to impress her any time an opportunity arose. One night in October, we were all hanging out at Toby's smoking weed like the fly little shits we were. And Maria said that she wished we could do something scary since Halloween was close, and it was her first in the States. Me, being the absolute scaredy cat that I am, loved the idea of doing scary things like ghost hunts and such, but actually doing them freaked me out. But wanting to impress her with my bravery, I suggested going to this place called Spider Gates. It's an old cemetery in Leicester, Massachusetts that is a bit of a hike into the woods and super old. It was supposed to be super haunted. So we drove the half hour in my dad's beat-up Pathfinder to the middle of nowhere until we came to the path that led deep into the woods where the cemetery was. I parked across the street. The car didn't really lock because it was so old and beat up, so we just left it and took the keys. We smoked a bowl or two on our way to the cemetery, and once we got there, we were stoned out of our minds. So we walk around the cemetery for a little while, and nothing significant really happens. We hear some rustling, which was probably just animals, and the wind blowing through the trees made eerie howling sounds, but it was nothing out of the ordinary. We go to a part of the cemetery where the ground is raised a bit, like you're standing on a stage, and there are trees surrounding it basically in a circle. And we smoke another bowl. We were there for, it must have been like 20 minutes just talking and smoking and laughing about stupid shit, when we heard loud, heavy crunches through leaves and twigs coming from deeper into the woods from the opposite direction that we had come. It didn't sound like an animal. We all quieted down and looked, but it had stopped. We shrugged it off quick and went back to smoking. John and I flirted pathetically with Maria, while Toby flirted with John, and it was a pretty good night. Then Maria stops and tells us to look into the woods. Right where she was pointing, probably like 50 to 100 yards away, there was a light. It basically looked like somebody was just holding a flashlight pointed toward us, but they were so far away that the beam didn't reach us. A few seconds later, it went out, and we could hear this really weird, high-pitched, hyena-like laughing. What the heck was that? We're miles away from houses. Before anybody really said anything, another light flashed on, this time a bit closer, and probably 50 or so yards to the left of the first one. We could hear running through the woods from the direction of the first light, when the second went out with the same creepy laughter. We communally decided to nope the heck out of there, and started pretty hastily back down the trail. It was a really dark night. I think the clouds were really heavy in front of the moon, so seeing anything besides what our cell phones illuminated in the night was pretty impossible. A couple minutes down the path, we started to calm down a bit and talk about what had just happened. But after only a few seconds of calm, the heavy footsteps started up behind us in the leaves. We stopped and turned. About 50 feet behind us, only barely visible, was the outline of something in the middle of the path. I probably would have pooped myself if I wasn't so high. John, being the brave macho guy, stepped out and yelled at whatever it was to leave us alone. A light switched on, I'm assuming in the person's hand, and they didn't move. They just stood there holding the light. This time, they were close enough for the beam to fall onto us, though. John yelled at the person for probably another 30 seconds or so before they turned off the light, and we could see him walking away, all while we heard the same crazy laughing from far in the woods. We quickly made our way out of there and went back to the car. We got in ready to drive as far away as we could, but when I turned the key, nothing. Not even the slow turning over. Nothing. John liked to think he knew about cars, so we all got out and he looked under the hood. The two cables that connect to the battery were hanging free. The screws that attach them around the posts or terminals or whatever you call them were missing. He didn't know if we could reconnect them without the screws, and honestly, I still don't. So we decided to call for help. No cell service. We're in the middle of the woods with a dead car and no way to contact anybody, and we were sure those creeps weren't far behind because we could hear them. Luckily, a minute or so after that, a car came down the road and, seeing our hood up, pulled to the side of the road to see if we needed help. I was really happy to see that it was two older women and not some maniacally laughing freak. We gladly accepted a ride from them to the nearest place with cell service and called my parents to pick us up. Needless to say, they were sort of upset with us for going to the cemetery in the first place, since it's technically trespassing, and for leaving the car there. But overall, they were glad we were fine after getting in the car with strangers, however nice and innocent they were. The next day, my dad, Toby, and I went back to get the car. Weirdly, we both had cell service. Not sure what was going on there. I'm just glad that those two old women came by and offered a ride when they did. I'm not exactly sure if they were just having some twisted version of fun, or if they were out to do actual harm, but I'm glad we didn't have the chance to find out. This happened around 10 to 12 years ago, and I completely forgot about it until now. It's a short story, but at the time, it absolutely terrified me. When I was younger, my whole block was filled with kids from my age, at the time around 9 to 11, and we would all play around the neighborhood near a cemetery that is right near my house. We all used to play until after dark, playing games like Ghost in the Graveyard and Tag and all that fun stuff, so it wasn't uncommon for us to be unattended around the block. It is a relatively safe neighborhood, and I still live in the same house, so I'm surprised this even happened. This particular day, my best friend and I, she was 2 years younger than me, decided to go look at the gravestones in the cemetery. We went in there and started browsing, amazed by the dates. We were preoccupied, so we didn't see the man who was walking aimlessly alone in the cemetery, not looking at any graves in particular, just walking. I saw him and told my friend that we should head back home because he was a bit creepy, and we were scrawny little girls. We head back home, and just as we are about to exit the cemetery, this older woman stops us and says, "You girls shouldn't come in here. There are creeps that walk through here," and gives a knowing, creepy smile. We said, "Sorry, we were just playing," and went our way. When we got back to our houses, we continued playing in the front yard, doing what little girls do, and suddenly, I look up and see the same man from the cemetery. I was a little creeped out, but didn't know at the time that this was something to watch out for. He started coming up towards us, trying to talk to us, and we just kept playing and running around like we didn't see him, and eventually, we went to my backyard, and we felt a little safer. An hour or so later, we think it is safe to venture back to the front yard, and we see him just sitting on the curb. I can now see that he wasn't dressed nicely, and maybe hadn't taken a bath in a while, and despite it being summer, he had a hat on, kinda like a beanie. We get really creeped out at this point and go tell our moms. My friend's dad comes out and shoos him away, and we think that's that. Another hour goes by, and we see the same man standing by our neighbor's backyard, which is visible from the street, trying to pet their dogs. We run in and tell her dad again, and he orders us to stay inside. We watch, interested, from the window, and God, I wish I hadn't. My best friend's dad runs across the street just in time to see the man standing near the same yard with a bite from the dog on one hand and the dog itself, dead, in the other. He ran down the alley just before my friend's dad could reach him. Our parents called the cops, but I don't think that he was ever found.